Okay, so good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Like I said in our last class, I was going to give you a brief video today reviewing chapters 5 and 6. And rather than have you do lecture notes, I want you to watch the video. I'm just going to pick out a couple key parts of the section, those two chapters, and then I'm going to give you throughout the video give you the option of some different writing prompts that I want you to respond to on the discussion board. And so you would only need to do your response. You wouldn't need to respond to anyone else's. Okay. So as the video rolls, also you should be seeing. I'll have those topics pop up as well as I say them. Okay. So for the first section of the book, this is the first section of chapter 5, I should say. Within a page or so of chapter 5, Billy Pilgrim is having a discussion with the Tralfamadorians, and he wanted to see one of their books, and so they present him one, and not that he's able to read their language, but he comments on the structure of their books, and the response here is that he thinks they look like telegrams, so meaning like brief stories that are written in these really brief kind of sections, separated by stars. And in a way, it's kind of very similar to the way that Slaughterhouse-Five is written. It doesn't show on this PDF, but in the book itself, where you have these like these sections that are divided off, these paragraph sections, or sometimes a little bit longer, that are divided off with like the three asterisks or the three stars. And the Tralfamadorians tell Billy that each clump of symbols is a brief, urgent message describing a situation, a scene, and that we read them all at once, not one after the other. So remember, their sense of time is not linear, but circular. And that it says they produce an image of life that is beautiful and surprising and deep. There is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes and effects. What we love in our books are the depths and of many marvelous moments seen all at one time, because they don't read section by section. They can see it all at once, remember. And so the first topic then is going to be based on this, which is going to be that I want you to address in what ways this novel could be seen as being written in the Tralfamadorian sense. That is specifically this part here where they talk about producing an image of life that is beautiful, surprising, and deep, and not having a beginning, middle, end, suspense, moral, causes, or effects. So applying that to this novel, in what ways would it be fitting this definition or these requirements, and maybe what ways would it not be maybe fitting those definitions or requirements? Okay, so the second section I want you to look at comes a little bit further in the book. Page 134, no, 135 of my version. I'm not sure if you guys are looking at the same version. But it's when the colonel is talking to Edgar Darby, or I'm sorry, Derby. And Edgar Derby, of course, is going to be the character who we already know is going to be killed at the end of the book. But anyway, he provides an interesting perspective here because he is so much older than the other soldiers, at least the American soldiers that he's serving with. And if you remember, his job is actually that he's a high school teacher, and so it sets up this interesting connection then with him and how he sees things versus how some of these other soldiers would see things. So he brings up this concept of the Children's Crusade, as he mentions here in this passage, that he's talking to someone who's closer to his age, and talking about how when you think of war is being fought by men, but really being here and experiencing it, you see how young most of the soldiers are, and that it's being fought by babies. And then he references specifically this idea of the Children's Crusade, which is one of the subtitles of the book, and also from chapter 1, as you remember, was brought up by Vonnegut's real life fellow soldier, his wife, who was upset about him going back and writing this book, and that he promised her he would make the focus of it the idea of the Children's Crusade. So the question here, if you choose to talk about this, would be, what's the significance of some of these other characters, soldier characters? So we have here Edgar Derby, who I talked about just a little bit, but we also have a couple other important ones in Lazaro, of course, who is a big part of chapter 5. Also Elliot Rosewater, who is someone that Billy spends time in the institution with. There are also the characters of the English soldiers who are in the prisoner of war camp with the American soldiers and their view of them. And there are also descriptions of some of the German soldiers as well. And so really feel free to talk about any one of these or them as a group in your response. Okay, so the next section is a little bit further in, maybe like 10 pages more, where it is Billy now being exhibited in the Tralfamadorian Zoo, and how they would bring the crowds around to look at him and watch him, and then try to teach these people, teach them about what the Earthlings were like and how limited their view of the world was and of time. And so the guide is basically creating this metaphor for the Tralfamadorians to help them understand the earthling perception of time. And in the metaphor, he basically describes how Billy's head is basically like being encased in steel, a steel sphere, which you could never take off. So that's kind of similar to our heads, skull, which, remember, the Tralfamadorians have very different structure. They have like multiple hands that kind of pop up out of where their head would be, with different fingers and whatnot. Anyway, so he says, and not only that, there's only one eye hole through which he could look out, and welded to with that eye hole is 6 feet of pipe. Now, obviously we have two eyes, but the idea that if we were to have tunnel vision, tunnel vision being like just being able to see down a tube in front of us, it would be like a single sphere. So even though we have two eyes, this idea of the eye hole being our vision and what we see, and the 6 feet of pipe representing this perspective where everything is sort of channeled into a distant viewpoint, off in the distance, that we can only see a little bit of at a time. It's like there's a effect. A distancing effect is what this is really talking about. And then he goes on to explain the metaphor even further. It says he was also basically the same as not just having this steel skull and this pipe, but being strapped onto a lattice, which was bolted onto a flat car on rails. So think of like a flat train car. And he can't turn his head or touch the pipe. And as the train's moving forward, all he basically sees is a dot at the end of the pipe. And because that's all he sees, he doesn't know any better or think there's anything unusual about that. And then you can see the description in the last paragraph here where it says, sometimes it crept, sometimes it went fast, sometimes it stopped, went uphill, downhill, around curves. Whatever poor Billy saw through the pipe, he had no choice but to say to himself, that's life. And so the topic that, if you choose to respond to this, what I want you to write about would be, in what ways does this represent how we see life? And address this metaphor, the different aspects of it, and what it's trying to show or say through its description of the human perception of life. Okay, so the next section here is just a couple pages later. After Billy makes comments that about how the Tralfamadorians basically have this peaceful society, and they explain to him that's not the case. That they have wars as well, and that basically they end up being responsible for the destruction of the universe, as they, because they see everything at once. They know that that's going to be coming, but that they can't prevent it. So Billy then makes the assumption that preventing war on Earth is stupid too. And remember, this really relates to what the one character was saying earlier about writing an anti-war book is like writing an anti-glacier book. It's just part of human nature, and there's nothing you can really do to avoid it. And as the Tralfamadorian response is that they don't focus on the negative, that there's nothing we can do about them, so we simply don't look at them. We ignore them, and we spend eternity looking at pleasant moments like today at the zoo. And that's very similar to the Serenity Prayer that Billy has hanging up in his office about not being able to, to accept the things you cannot change. And then they give the advice that what earthlings should learn to do would be to ignore the awful times and concentrate on the good ones. And Billy just says, And so the question here I want you to, if you choose to respond to this, would be, to what extent does Billy follow this advice? Do you think he does or does not follow this advice? Now, as I mentioned before, he has the Serenity Prayer in his office, and he certainly has been converted to the Tralfamadorian view of life and death, and that death is not that big of a deal. So do you think that he really follows this advice where he focuses on, ignores the awful times and concentrates on the good ones? Do you really see that present in his story? And the next section here, I'm not going to give you a topic for this, but I just wanted to point this out as it relates to some of the main ideas in the book at the end of chapter 5. And really, this is where Vonnegut brings the historical past into the present, because remember, this book was written in 1969, the height of the Vietnam War, and so in many ways this book is coming as a result of what is happening with that war. So a lot of critiques about American politics or American society, the propensity for war in human society, etc. A lot of that's not just reflecting his own personal experience in Dresden in World War II, but also what the current events were in Vietnam. And so he brings in this boy who's a young boy whose father was killed in Vietnam, and Billy Pilgrim is examining his eyes. And the mom had told the story about him being upset about his father. And when Billy then tells him about his own experience and what he learned, and the idea that his father is still very much alive, and the boy will see him again in the future, even though he's passed away, the mom becomes very upset with Billy Pilgrim for telling him that, and the idea that giving him false comfort. Or giving him false hope, but really this not just bringing this connection into the current events of Vietnam at the time the book was written, but also this idea of memory being part of the present. So even if it's not something that, even if you don't believe in living all moments at once, there's still this sense that people live within our memories, and experiences live within our memories, and to a certain extent we can relive them again and again. And that point comes up again very shortly after that, in the beginning of chapter 6, when Billy talks about, or fast forwards to his death. What he tells the crowd when basically he says it's describing the event of his death, which is linked to his experience in the war with Lazaro. But he basically says that if you think death is a terrible thing, you've not understood a word I said. And then he says his closing, which is farewell, hello, which is linking the end and the beginning. But the same thing is what he's telling the boy is that death is not the end; it's a stage, and all stages are endlessly repeating. So that once Billy does experience death, it's brief, and it's sort of like a void, an absence. There's a light and a hum, but there's nothing else there. And then immediately after that, he jumps back into life. So chapter 6 is very concerned or portrays heavily not just Billy's death here, but the focus of the chapter is on these war experiences. So the last time, specifically the prisoner of war experience in Dresden. So the last topic here that I want to have you look at is going to come at the end of chapter 6. So this description of the slaughterhouse where these events are going to take place is significant, not only, of course, because you already know that's the title and he's mentioned it a number of times, but also as far as establishing the symbolism here and this relationship that this place would have with other places in the book. And that's what I'm going to give you as the writing topic here for this last one. So the described slaughterhouse being empty, but that many animals had been killed there and eaten by human beings, mostly soldiers. So you can already start to see a lot of the parallels here that he's making between the animals and the soldiers. But that the idea also that how they were kept with the bunks and the latrine, etc. And that's going to not just be similar to the previous prisoner of war camp, but also some other locations in the novel. And their address that they are being given and told to memorize, which is Slaughterhouse 5 and in German. But that the relevance of this as far as the title, but also like this, the relevance of this as this place of that's the fate that has brought them all together into this place. Now, we already know how this is all going to turn out, that in a sense, this place is going to be their refuge. And this is being in this particular building, in this particular place, is what's going to actually allow them to survive. Not all of which, of course, obviously is beyond their control. And so there's a certain irony there that the slaughterhouse is a place of death. In the case of this book, though, in the events of Billy Pilgrim, this particular slaughterhouse ends up being a source of life for them. But what I want you to write about, if you choose to, on this would be the relation that this particular place, the importance that this particular place, the connection or the relation that it would have to other places in the book, other physical settings. If you think about it, there's a number of places in the book where Billy is basically held or kept, and so the question is going to have you really examine that and look at what some of those connections would be and how some of these places would relate, and maybe then also where they might be a little bit different as well. So that's it for today. If you go to the discussion board, the discussion board is just going to reference you back to one of these questions that I mentioned in the video. So write a detailed paragraph response, and like I said before, you don't need to respond to anyone else's. Just do your own response. Okay. So have a good weekend. I'll talk to you guys later. Be safe. Take care.